if ever you think you've had a bad travel experience, you should just think about what the Irish immigrants, and the German immigrants for that matter, and even the English and the Dutch before them, what pretty much all immigrants coming to the United States before the advent of steamships around the 1860s had to go through. Now the Irish situation was by far the worst because they were so poor and the shipping companies were so venal that they squeezed many more immigrants into these ships than they should have. So your typical steerage compartment wouldn't have been much bigger than this room. This is right about the right size, but maybe this is too wide actually. So about this length, but less wide. And you could have, in a room like this, what do we have here? Maybe 75, 100 people. So you would have had 200 people, and maybe in some ships 400 people in this space. Some ships 500 people. And so how did you do that, you might wonder? Well, so you had bunks, and they would be triple bunks. And so they would go from floor to ceiling. And then in addition, you would sleep 2 or 3 per bunk. One of the worst parts was you didn't necessarily get to share the bunk with someone you knew, because to squeeze as many people on, if you were a single woman and there was a family of 3 and there was one space for one more person in the bunk, you had to squeeze in with that family. And it's only after the Civil War, the American Civil War, that they decided to segregate the sexes and segregate single women from all the men. It turns out that not only are the single men, first they segregate the single women from the single men, but it turns out the married men are just as bad at groping the single women, and so they just end up, all the women have to be separate from all the men on the ships. But that only happens after by the 1870s. And so you're crammed into these bunks, and then one of the big problems of being on these ships was lice was a big problem. Not the kind of benign head lice we have today, which is, it's embarrassing, but don't cause you any problems. But these are body lice. And the body lice would make you sick because the lice would defecate on you, and then you would itch the lice, and the lice feces would get under your skin, and it had bacteria in it. And you got what was known as ship fever. And ship fever, you got a high fever, you vomited. It was just a terrible thing. Now imagine that you're not on the top bunk and the people have ship fever above you. Where is that vomit going? It's going right onto you, because you don't have a steel bunk. You're talking about burlap or wood slats, and so the vomit's coming right down on you, and it's just terrible. And that's just one of the many diseases you could catch on a ship. And so at the height of the Irish potato famine, it was common for a couple of dozen people to be dead by the time the ship got to New York, and a couple of dozen more to die soon after landing because they had gotten infected but not yet very sick when the ship would land. And then if you were unlucky enough, like a lot of New York Irish immigrants actually went to Canada first because it was cheaper to go to Canada initially. And some of those ships, hundreds of people died. And so it was an awful experience.
I'll never complain about Spirit Airlines again. You talk about what happened when they get here, and Ellis Island. Now, this was, to me, this really blew my mind. Nobody's names got changed at Ellis Island. So every immigrant movie that we've ever seen is wrong. They didn't come here and then the customs guy or the immigration guys couldn't pronounce the long Polish or German name and then gave them a new American name. This did not happen.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is one of those many immigration myths, and probably one of the most prevalent ones. That at Ellis Island, the people who worked there had no authority to give you a name. And in fact, when you left Ellis Island, you didn't leave with any piece of paper at all. You were just passed, and in you went. The paper all stayed behind at Ellis Island. So there was nothing you were handed that said, here's your new name. There was nobody who could say to you, here's your new name. What you have to realize is each immigrant or entire immigrant family had to be processed in 1 minute. And by law, each inspector had to ask those immigrants 30 questions. So, and they had to ask all the questions. So there was no time to give you a new name. So what we historians tend to theorize is that a lot of immigrants decide to change their name to try to make them seem more American. Though we often laugh at how un-American the names they chose are, as the case in my family. But so one theory is that a lot of immigrants who changed their names, to make their business seem more American or whatever, were embarrassed about that fact, and so later said, well, it was that guy at Ellis Island who made me do it, when in fact it was the immigrants themselves who chose how their names would be spelled.